Welcome back to Inside the Story. Our story today is set in Milan, in Milan's high society, Milan at its finest, the Milan of finance. We are just a few steps away from the famous Teatro della Scala. We are in the heart of what we could call Milan's financial district, the heart of Italian finance. It's the early 1980s, the ambitious 1980s, the years of so-called drink and spend Milan. And it's the beginning of summer, a warm evening like many others, maybe even warmer than usual. Because inside a bank, a very famous bank near Piazza Paolo Ferrari, a tragedy is unfolding, in fact, a double tragedy. The first is metaphorical. It takes place during a dramatic board meeting that ends with the decision to accept the liquidator appointed by the Bank of Italy. The second comes soon after the first, less than an hour since the board meeting ended, when a heavy thud is heard, something that has fallen from above and then screams, "The young lady, the young lady." A lot of people leaning out from the balconies, looking inside, running into the inner courtyard. Because on the ramp that leads to the garages, there is a body, the body of a 55-year-old woman. The floral dress has slightly lifted, almost covering the woman's face, who hit the ground there, ending her life, but behind that death. Classified as a suicide, there are many things that don't add up. There are many stories to look into. And today, by telling the story of the death of Graziella Teresa Corrocher, we at Inside the Story will try to shed light on all of this. Inside the headquarters of Banco Ambrosiano, which in those days is shaken by the storm. The president, Roberto Calvi, has disappeared, vanished. No one knows where he is. And it's very strange also because his passport had previously been taken away. He had already been convicted of a crime and was at the center not only of rumors and newspaper articles, but also of some investigations by judicial authorities. Banco Ambrosiano itself, the temple of Italian Catholic finance. It is the focus of many watchful eyes, competing interests, and multiple investigations. It's also interesting to observe from a map of Milan how the headquarters at the time of Banco Ambrosiano is located on the straight line that connects Piazza dei Mercanti, where it was based. A bank that was identified as one of the banks used by Cosa Nostra to launder dirty money. At the time of Sindona, with what is now called Piazzetta Cuccia, that is, the Temple of Mediobanca, the Sancta Sanctorum of secular Italian finance. Along this route, you can find the Ambrosiano bunker itself, this tall building with an inner courtyard. Inside that courtyard lies the lifeless body of Graziella Teresa Corrocher, 55 years old, originally from Conegliano in the province of Treviso. Graziella Teresa Corrocher came to Milan as a young woman to work at Banco Ambrosiano, and she had a unique career. She worked mainly in administration at Ambrosiano, and 7 years earlier, she had become the secretary of Roberto Calvi, the new president of the bank, the man who had managed to climb the ranks from the bottom, practically starting at the counter, until he became the head of one of the most important banks in Italy. Graziella Corrocher is much more than just an employee to Calvi. Think about this. Graziella Corrocher lives in the Fiera Campionaria area, less than 500 meters from Via Frua, where the Calvi family actually lives. Graziella Corrocher leaves her house in the morning around 7:30, sometimes 7:15, slightly before the bank's president. She goes to work and leaves the Ambrosiano headquarters after the president has left. According to several observers, Graziella Corrocher is Calvi's confidant and the one to whom Calvi entrusts many secrets. But in those days, in June 1982, she is a profoundly changed woman because the disappearance of Roberto Calvi caught her by surprise. Not even she knows what happened to the president of Banco Ambrosiano. They ask her about it. Vice President Roberto Rossoni asks her. Not long before, he had been the target of an attack by the boss of the Magliana gang, Danilo Abruciati. Orazio Bagnasco asks her, the financier who was brought into Banco Ambrosiano by politicians in an attempt to avoid receivership. But she doesn't know how to answer. Some people suspect that she's being evasive, that she doesn't want to answer the questions, that she still wants to keep Calvi's secrets. But is that really the case? Or is there something else? Or is there something that even Graziella Corrocher can't say? When June 17, 1982 arrives, Graziella Corrocher is a woman with a vacant look in her eyes. Her colleagues at work notice it too. She is no longer the kind, smiling, yet extremely determined woman people had seen in the previous days. Besides, Graziella Corrocher could have retired. Just a week earlier, on June 10, 1982, Graziella Corrocher reached 35 years of work, enough to retire, yet she refuses. She wants to stay at her job. It is said that the real reason Corrocher gave was that, with the bank in the middle of a storm, everyone should stay at their post, even the president's secretary. Leaving right at that moment during a critical time for the bank would be a bad sign not just for Corrocher, but for everyone, especially for the bank, which is fighting tooth and nail to survive. Calvi, as we said, has disappeared without a trace. We will find out later what happened to him. He relied on Flavio Carboni and Silvano Vittor, who helped him leave the country for Yugoslavia by speedboat via Trieste. Then from there, they took him to Austria. From Austria, he was supposed to go to Switzerland, but that didn't happen. In the end, he took refuge in London, at the Chelsea Cloister, an apartment hotel, not even that luxurious. In fact, hiding from everything and everyone, in a desperate attempt to save himself and the bank. But Graziella Corrocher doesn't know any of this. In the last 2 days, the secretary has been acting strange. Sometimes she doesn't answer the phone. She's afraid to pick up the receiver. When she runs into the members of the board of directors, whom she used to deal with as equals, she lowers her gaze and pretends nothing is wrong. She turns the corner, as if she's ashamed of something. On the afternoon of June 17, 1982, the last meeting of the bank's board of directors takes place. There are 2 proposals on the table. The first, entrust the institution to a new president, to a new board of directors. The second, declare the entire board of directors dismissed and call for a liquidator. The meeting is extremely tense. Graziella Corrocher doesn't leave her desk, but he senses the tension in the air. Inside the board of directors, harsh words are flying. There is only one point everyone agrees on: the dismissal of Roberto Calvi as president. You can't go on with a president who is on the run, a fugitive. They need someone to rely on at all times, especially during the most difficult moments. While the meeting is in progress, Graziella Corrocher is seen at her desk writing. She isn't typing, she's not typing anything. No, she has a sheet of paper in her hand taken from a notepad, and with a small, thin, red marker pen, she's writing something on that sheet. That sheet is somewhat her last confession, and it is handed over to the vice president of the bank, Roberto Rossone, shortly after 7:37 p.m. After those screams, the young lady, the thud, the call to emergency services to request an ambulance have already echoed there, inside the Ambrosiano headquarters. What is written on that sheet? It's somewhat a testament from Corrocher, with some recommendations and with real curses. That sheet is written in an almost shaky handwriting, written by a person who, most likely, is in the grip of a nervous breakdown. Let's start with these words. I apologize for the trouble I cause. Inform my sister who has heart problems indirectly and with every precaution. Consider my nervous breakdown as the most malignant of tumors that can strike you at any age and without remedy. These words show Corrocher's deep humanity, who, never married, has no children, and has always dedicated her entire life to work. But what follows, the next letters, the next words, are like stab wounds. How can I recover from a nervous breakdown? How unhappy my transition really was, in fact, to the last president, that last president, Roberto Calvi, whom Corrocher mentions indirectly, never mentioning him by name and surname. How much coldness, how much dissatisfaction, despite everything I associate myself with the board's statement. I certainly don't associate myself with it anymore. What a shame. He ran away. May he be damned for all the harm he has done to all of us at the bank and the group, whose image we were once so proud of. This last legacy, this letter from Graziella Corrocher, is something enigmatic and at the same time obvious. It is her final confession. She no longer wanted to cover up what Roberto Calvi had done in his last year. The desperate attempts at alliances, sometimes with secular finance, sometimes with Opus Dei, sometimes with Monsignor Marcinkus, to plug the leak. That more than $1 billion disappeared from the coffers of Ambrosiano and its foreign subsidiaries. She didn't even want to cover up the escape anymore. Something disgraceful. Calvi had left, abandoning his old collaborators, starting with Corrocher, there, alone, to face the inevitable. But something doesn't add up. No one saw Graziella Teresa Corrocher open the window, move the chair, climb onto the chair, and throw herself out. No one saw her at all. Everyone heard the thud. That, yes, unmistakable. A body falling onto the concrete. Everyone saw the body. And then the screams. Normal. But no one actually saw her, taking the last steps toward her own suicide. And then that suspicion piles up, that terrible suspicion. Are we sure that Graziella Corrocher really killed herself? And if she did kill herself, are we sure that no one drove her to do it? These suspicions linger for quite some time until the public prosecutor's office decides to close the case as a simple suicide. Not even the search of her house at 31 Correggio Street provides any clear answers. Her co-workers were interviewed. Everyone says that she was extremely punctual, dedicated to her duty, very capable, even tough when necessary. But that in the last few days she had changed. She was different. One of the clerks on the first floor of Banco Ambrosiano reveals that she was very exhausted, and the events of these last few days had particularly affected her. The death of Graziella Teresa Corrocher closes a chapter in Milan, but leaves open the question of what actually happened in those rooms during the board meeting. Journalistic reports describe a tense atmosphere, difficult to unravel, with Vice President Rossone asserting himself, supported by many other board members, against Orazio Bagnasco, the man who came from politics. Of course, the request for a liquidator for Banco Ambrosiano means the end, and everyone knows it's the end. No one will be able to plug that huge leak. Later, a group of banks willing to take on a share of that monstrous debt will be needed. But what did Corrocher really know? She was the one who kept all of Calvi's secrets, the one who knew about Calvi's movements. She was the one who, the previous summer, had booked the villa in Sardinia for the Calvi family's vacation. Those holidays during which the bank president had met, introduced by mutual friends, Flavio Carboni. What did she really know? Or maybe she did know, but she was excluded from the final part, from the decision to escape with a fake passport, a photo without the mustache, with that name, Gian Roberto Calvini, as if that would be enough to cross the borders. Maybe she had experienced it as a personal betrayal after having kept every secret of her president for so long, better than any safe. She took it badly, especially this sudden about-face. Maybe she expected Calvi to say something to her, to involve her in his last desperate attempt. Or maybe she expected to take part in the escape herself. Or maybe, and this is the most likely hypothesis, she expected Calvi to finally face his responsibilities and actually find a solution. That solution had been talked about for months, but which in the end didn't exist. The death of Graziella Teresa Corrocher remains partially an unsolved mystery in our contemporary history, which turns into news. Her obituary is published on the morning of June 18, 1982, exactly at the same time when, in London, under Blackfriars Bridge, the body of Roberto Calvi is found. There, hanging with a macabre staging, it's almost a sign of fate, a passing. The secretary who dies just a few hours before her boss, after disowning him, after shaming him, after even cursing him. As if Calvi were paying in those hours for the curse of the woman who had left everything for him, who had always given everything for the bank and for its president, and who until the very end had guarded his most important documents, his secrets. If you want to see it this way, the death of Graziella Corrocher foreshadows, just a few hours earlier, the earthly end of Roberto Calvi. She died by spontaneous or induced suicide in the courtyard, falling 4 floors down to the garage ramp. He died a few hours later in London by strangulation and was then hanged with a rope or a noose to a scaffold under Blackfriars Bridge, marked by symbolism that speaks of revenge, the most atrocious revenge, the cruelest revenge. But it wasn't the revenge of a woman alone and betrayed. If anything, it was the revenge of other people, but at this point, we have to ask ourselves, are we sure that these other people, those orbiting Cosa Nostra and the Magliana gang, didn't have some kind of influence even on the tragic end of Graziella Corrocher? That money that had disappeared from Ambrosiano and was supposed to finance Solidarność in Poland, compensated by funds that came from Cosa Nostra, from Licio Gelli, from the Magliana, and these too had disappeared instead of being laundered. Are we sure that they didn't lead to the death not only of Calvi, but also of his secretary? These are questions that don't have a clear answer. There's that verdict, suicide. But even Calvi, at first his death was labeled as suicide. Only later was an open verdict issued in an attempt to admit that maybe it wasn't the desperate final act of a banker on the run, but something else, a murder. For Graziella Corrocher, there was no Corrocher verdict, also because Italian law doesn't allow for it. But the doubt remains 44 years later, if you'll allow us. It still hangs over the tragic disappearance of a woman who had devoted her whole life to the dream of working for one of Italy's finest banks, one of Europe's most powerful, and who, after refusing to retire, saw everything crumble in her hands at such a speed that it surely caused her a psychological breakdown and perhaps led her to take that final extreme step. It frightened everyone, and with that curse, foretold the end of the Ambrosiano and also of its president on the run.